Last week we talked about file input. This week we're going to talk about file output. How do we write text out to a file? Just like with file input, it's designed to look really similar to when we do stuff with the console. So I've written a really short program here where I just display some sample output, and then I create a new student object, and I wrote a method called displayStudent. So if we go to the student class, you can see displayStudent here just uses the printf to display some information on the screen. So how do we change this so all the output goes to a file instead of onto the screen? We're going to use a variable called a printWriter. So I'm going to start with printWriter, I'll call it fileout equals new printWriter, and then whatever the file name I want. And I'm actually going to create this as a constant. So I'll write up here private static final. We'll just call it output.txt. So I need to say here I'd like this file name to be used. And we could just write it directly in here. We'll see one place where we use it again later. And it's helpful, especially if this is a long program, to have the file up at the top so that if we want to change it, it's really easy to find the file name. So it doesn't quite like this because we have to import. Just like with reading from a file, we have to import from java.io. And when we're doing things with files, sometimes we have to import so much. We could write printWriter and import. If we're doing some file in as well, we might use the file, and we'll see later some exceptions as well. What we can do is actually just write java.io.star, which means import everything from java.io. I want to include the printWriter, I want to include the file, I want to include any exceptions that are part of that. So it's just a way to shorthand import everything from java.io. Now we're still getting an error because this needs to be in try-catch, just like file input. We saw with file input that the file just might not be there, so we might not be able to find a file. That's okay with file output because it'll just create the file. However, if the folder it's in doesn't exist, we'll get an exception. Or maybe the folder does exist, but we don't have permission to create the file, things like that. So there's still common exceptions that can happen. Let's write try and put this whole thing in the catch block. And then let's scooch these lines over. Great. So now we've created the file to display output in. How do we actually get the output there? Well, that's really simple. We actually just replace system.out with file out. So the print line, printf, print are all the same as they are with system.out. Instead of using system.out, we use our file printWriter, and then it'll go to the file instead of to the screen. We're just displaying the text some sample output. The student output will still get displayed on the screen. But I want to show you that this won't quite work because there's an error that I do a lot. I'm going to run the program. We'll get the student output here, but in theory, our some sample output should be showing up in the file. So I'll open the workspace. I'll go to our project, and here's our output file, but there's nothing in it. What's going on? Well, just like I like to do with the scanner, I forgot to close the file. And this is one of the most common errors when you get no output. It sounds really confusing. We just told the file to write this text and it didn't show up in the file. That's because until we close the file, Windows stores some of that information behind the scenes and doesn't actually write it. So now that we've closed the file, it'll get written to the file, and our output will actually say some sample output, just like we'd expect. Now the last thing to change here, we want to change our Sarah.displayStudent. We want to change this method so it goes to our file as well. In order to do that, we really need to know the printWriter that we should write to. So I'm going to create here as a parameter, here's the printWriter you should write to. And I'm going to again replace system.out with our fileout variable. It's giving me an error message here because I also here need to import java.io.printWriter up at the top. So I'm in a separate file, which means I need the imports here as well. But once that's done, this should display on the file as well. And when I call the method, I just need to say, here's the print writer you should use, file out. And that's it. So I've changed all the system.outs to file out, and in order to do that in a method, I had to give it the file output that it should use. Nothing on the screen when we run the program. We might want to change that. We might want some output on the screen and some output to the file, but just to demonstrate this, I'm doing all the output to the file. Open output.txt again. Now all the output is showing up very nicely in the file. Now I want to show you one more thing we can do with exceptions. So the print writer, and you'll notice actually if I hold my mouse over the print writer, this will show throws file not found exception. So it's going to tell me what kind of exceptions it might throw. Maybe I want to catch just that exception. So if I write down here file not found exception, not just any exception, but specifically this will catch a file not found exception. And I'd like a specific message for that. And let's add the file name here. That will be a specific exception just if the file is not found. If any other exception happens in this try section, it's going to get ignored because I'm only catching file not found exceptions. Maybe I'd like to catch those and do one thing, and for any other exception do something else. I can have one catch after another, and I can actually do this for as many catches as I would like with different types of exceptions. My last one might be catch exception, and this will mean any exception. I want to do the following code. And this is almost like an if and if else statement. If an exception happens, it'll go through each catch and see, am I a file not found exception? If I am, I'll do this code, and then I'll skip all the rest of the catches. But if it's a different kind of exception, maybe an array index out of bounds exception, it'll check here. Well, that's not a file not found exception. It'll go to the next catch and the next catch. And we should generally have a catch exception EX at the very end that will catch any exception. So any exception here, if we don't find it until then, we'll do the code in this catch exception.